The department store bustled with people rushing between aisles, holding up clothes to inspect, and testing out various items on display. Maya Thompson moved purposefully through the store, her mind already on the business trip she'd be taking the next day. She had a list of last-minute items to buy, but other than that, she was ready. A bit of shopping, a quiet evening to get some rest, and she'd be all set to go. Dressed in a sleek but comfortable outfit, Maya looked professional and put together, though she was tired after a long week of work. She glanced around the store, scanning for the travel section. She noticed the store was unusually crowded for a Wednesday evening, but she moved forward without paying much attention to the other customers or staff. It wasn't until she noticed a tall, uniformed officer standing at the entrance to the store that she felt the slightest bit uneasy. She didn't think too much of it at first. Security guards and sometimes even police officers were stationed in this part of town, especially in larger stores like this one. But the officer was looking directly at her, his expression unreadable. She thought for a moment that she was imagining it, but each time she turned down an aisle, there he was, appearing at the other end, watching her intently. The officer's eyes followed her every move, narrowing whenever she paused to look at an item. She felt herself tense under his scrutiny, and she couldn't help but wonder what had piqued his interest in her. She wasn't doing anything unusual, just shopping, like everyone else. But with each passing moment, her initial discomfort grew into a sense of unease. She thought about brushing it off, but something about his gaze seemed deliberate, almost predatory. Finally, as she picked up a set of toiletries and placed them in her basket, she turned around to see him standing just a few feet away from her. "Ma'am," he said in a flat tone, his voice loud enough to catch the attention of a few nearby shoppers. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Maya was startled but quickly composed herself, giving him a polite nod. "Of course, officer. Is there something I can help you with?" His expression remained cold, and he looked her up and down as if assessing a threat. "We've had reports of some suspicious activity around this area," he said slowly. "I'll need to ask you some questions about what you've been doing here today." Maya's eyebrows knitted together in confusion. "I'm just doing a bit of shopping," she replied, keeping her tone as calm as possible. "Is there a problem?" The officer, whose name badge read Officer Bradley, seemed unimpressed with her answer. "Suspicious activity has been reported, and we take these things very seriously. I'd like to see your items and check your bag." Maya felt a wave of anger rising but tried to keep her voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, trying to remain polite but assertive. "I'm a paying customer, just like everyone else here. What exactly is the issue?" Without responding directly to her, Officer Bradley's expression hardened. "Step over here," he ordered, motioning her toward a quieter corner of the store. He didn't wait for her to respond before starting to walk, his assumption clear: she would comply. Reluctantly, Maya followed, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. She could feel the eyes of other shoppers on her as she moved, people pausing in their tracks to watch. She was acutely aware of the image this was projecting, a lone black woman being singled out and escorted to the side by a stern-looking officer. Every instinct told her this was wrong, but she felt caught, unsure of how to proceed without making the situation worse. As they reached the far corner of the store, Officer Bradley turned to face her. "Now," he said, his voice colder than before, "I'm going to need you to open your bag and let me see what you've taken." Maya's heart pounded in her chest, her frustration nearly boiling over. She took a deep breath, struggling to keep her composure. "I haven't taken anything," she replied firmly. "Everything I have is in this basket, and I haven't even gone to check out yet. I don't appreciate being accused of something I didn't do." Bradley's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Maya thought she saw a flicker of satisfaction in his expression, as if he'd been expecting this reaction. "We have reason to believe that you might be involved in some kind of theft here," he said, his voice dripping with an accusatory tone. "So, if you're innocent, you won't mind letting me check your bag." Unless, of course, you have something to hide. At this point, Maya could feel her hands beginning to shake. She could hardly believe what was happening. All she wanted was to finish her shopping and go home. She wasn't about to stand there and be treated like a criminal for no reason. Still, Maya knew she had to stay calm. Losing her temper would only make things worse, and she refused to give this officer the satisfaction of seeing her break. "Fine," she said, trying to keep her tone steady as she opened her bag. "Go ahead. You'll see there's nothing there but my wallet and some personal items." But as Officer Bradley began rummaging through her bag with a complete lack of respect for her belongings, Maya felt a wave of humiliation wash over her. She couldn't believe she was standing there, being treated like a criminal over some baseless suspicion. Around her, more people had gathered, whispering and exchanging looks. "I don't see anything unusual here," she said quietly, hoping he would realize his mistake and let her go. But Bradley didn't seem interested in admitting any mistake. With a slight smirk, he looked down at the items in her basket. "I'll still need to check these," he said. Maya felt her patience fraying. "I told you, I haven't even purchased those yet. They're in my basket, exactly where they should be." But Bradley wasn't listening. His gaze turned cold, and he leaned in closer. "Maybe I need to check a little more thoroughly," he said, his tone sharp. Maya's heart pounded faster as she realized where this was headed. This was no simple search, this was an accusation wrapped in an excuse for an invasion of her personal space. She took a step back, her voice firm. "This has gone far enough. I'm done cooperating with these baseless accusations." Bradley's face hardened, and he took a step forward. "You think you can walk away from this?" Maya stood her ground, think so, looking Officer Bradley squarely in the eye. "I don't see what justification you have to continue this," she said firmly, lifting her chin. She could feel her heart racing, but she was determined not to let her fear show. If he expected her to cower, he was in for a disappointment. The tension between them thickened, drawing the attention of nearby shoppers who had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Whispers and glances flitted around, and Maya could feel the weight of those stares on her, but she wasn't about to let that pressure get to her. This wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel out of place in a public setting, but it was the first time it had escalated to this extent. "You're refusing to comply with a lawful investigation," Bradley said with a smirk, his eyes flashing with an almost triumphant look. "I could take you down to the station, you know. Make it official." Maya clenched her fists, her anger boiling over. She kept her voice low and steady, barely concealing the frustration simmering beneath. "You haven't even told me what I'm being accused of," she replied, "because there's no evidence of wrongdoing." At that, Officer Bradley's smirk widened, and he took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Or maybe you're just good at hiding it," he said, eyes darting to her belongings as if they held the secret to some grand scheme. "Ladies like you think they can get away with anything, but I know better." Maya inhaled sharply, trying to rein in her fury. She was tempted to just leave, but she knew turning her back on him would only escalate things. Besides, this was about more than just her, it was about standing up to an injustice that could happen to anyone, anywhere. As Maya grappled with her next move, another figure stepped into the scene. A young store associate approached, her face a mix of apprehension and determination. She had clearly witnessed enough to feel compelled to intervene, despite the potential risk of confronting an officer. "Excuse me, officer," the associate said politely, glancing nervously between Bradley and Maya. "I don't think Ms. Thompson has done anything wrong. I saw her browsing, just like everyone else. She hasn't left the store or tried to conceal anything." Officer Bradley turned his icy gaze on the associate, his expression twisting with annoyance. "And who are you?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. "I'm in the middle of a lawful investigation, and unless you're trained in law enforcement, I'd advise you to keep out of it." The associate visibly swallowed, but she didn't back down. "I'm an employee here," she said quietly. And I think Ms. Thompson deserves to be treated with respect. If there was an issue, I'm sure I or another employee would have noticed. Maya shot the young woman a grateful look, and the gesture gave her the boost she needed to stay calm. She wasn't alone in this. Someone else saw what was going on and wasn't afraid to speak up. Still, Officer Bradley's scowl deepened, clearly not pleased with being challenged in front of an audience. "All right, that's enough," he said, his tone now laced with a barely concealed anger. "Ms. Thompson, if you refuse to comply with a search, I'll have no choice but to bring you to the precinct for questioning." Maya's heart skipped a beat. This was escalating faster than she'd anticipated. She hadn't stolen a single thing, yet here she was being threatened with an arrest. "I'm not refusing a search," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm refusing to be harassed without cause." Bradley's eyes flashed, and he took a menacing step forward. But before he could speak again, a loud, clear voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see a tall, imposing figure stride forward. He wore a crisp navy suit, and his presence commanded attention. His piercing gaze moved from Maya to Officer Bradley, his expression unreadable but intense. The onlookers quieted, sensing the shift in authority. Bradley's demeanor changed instantly. "Captain Andrews," he stammered, straightening as if caught off guard. "I was just questioning this individual on suspicion of theft." Captain Andrews didn't immediately respond. Instead, he took a step toward Maya, his gaze appraising. "Is that so?" he said, more to himself than anyone else, before turning to Bradley with a raised eyebrow. "And what led you to believe she's guilty of theft?" Officer Bradley cleared his throat, his face taking on an uncharacteristic look of discomfort. "Well, sir, she's been acting suspiciously. Moving around a lot, looking at various items, like she might be trying to hide something." Maya felt her frustration bubble over. "I'm simply shopping, Captain," she interjected, her voice calm but firm. "Nothing about my behavior has been suspicious. This officer has been singling me out without reason." Captain Andrews listened to her, his expression growing thoughtful. He turned back to Bradley, his tone carefully measured. "Officer, are you aware that accusations without concrete evidence can easily cross into harassment territory?" Officer Bradley shifted uncomfortably, glancing away. "Yes, sir, but I believe it was justified in this instance. I was only doing my job." Captain Andrews took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "Doing your job doesn't mean targeting individuals based on assumptions. Ms. Thompson is not the first person you've taken this approach with, correct?" Bradley's face flushed, and he opened his mouth as if to respond, but Captain Andrews silenced him with a raised hand. "This is not the time or place for confrontations with customers without due cause." The tension in the store had shifted, and Maya felt a faint glimmer of hope. It seemed like someone in a position of authority was finally questioning Officer Bradley's behavior, and she was ready to see how this would play out. But before anyone could speak again, a loud, panicked scream echoed from the other end of the store. Maya's attention snapped in the direction of the sound, her heart pounding as she saw people scattering, ducking behind shelves and displays. "What's going on?" she whispered, glancing at Captain Andrews. A second later, a figure burst into view, a young man in a dark hoodie, clutching a handgun and scanning the area with a frantic look. The panic in his eyes suggested desperation more than calculated intent, but the sight of the weapon sent the crowd into a frenzy. Bradley instantly sprang into action, his hand moving to his own gun as he barked out, "Get down, everyone." He shot Maya a hard look. "Stay out of the way," he ordered, as if she were an inconvenience. Captain Andrews, however, stepped protectively between Maya and the armed man. "Everyone stay calm," he called, his voice authoritative. "Sir," he said to the gunman, "you don't need to do this. Put the gun down, and we can talk." The young man's gaze flickered, his grip on the gun shaking. For a tense moment, No one moved, and Maya held her breath, watching as Captain Andrews tried to defuse the situation. But Officer Bradley's tension was palpable, his hand twitching on his weapon as he tried to gauge the right moment to intervene. Seconds stretched into eternity as the gunman's breathing grew erratic, his eyes darting between Captain Andrews and Bradley. In the silence, Maya's mind raced, wondering how this would end, and if Officer Bradley's impulsiveness might push things past the point of no return. The air was thick with tension, every second stretching on like an eternity. Maya's eyes darted back and forth between the young gunman and the officers in front of her. Officer Bradley's fingers twitched over his holstered weapon, eyes narrowed as he kept his gaze trained on the armed young man. It was clear that Bradley was waiting for any slight excuse to draw, his hand itching for action. Captain Andrews, however, maintained a calmer demeanor, stepping in front of Maya and the bystanders who had been trapped in the line of fire. "Hey," Captain Andrews called out, keeping his voice steady and low as he took slow steps forward, hands raised to show he meant no harm. "I don't know what you're going through, but we can figure it out. Just put down the gun, and we can talk." The young man's breathing was heavy, his wide eyes filled with panic. His hand holding the gun shook, and he glanced around, as if suddenly realizing the gravity of his situation. He seemed barely out of his teens, his face marked by a desperation that told Maya he was likely in way over his head. The other shoppers stood frozen, watching the unfolding scene with expressions of fear and disbelief. Officer Bradley, however, looked like he was done waiting. He moved slightly to the side, trying to position himself for a shot. "Captain," he hissed, barely able to contain himself, "this kid is a threat. We need to neutralize him before he hurts someone." But Captain Andrews held up a hand, his voice firm. "Stand down, Bradley. I have this under control." Bradley's jaw clenched, frustration evident in his expression. He didn't take orders easily, especially in situations that threatened his need for control. Maya could see the storm brewing in his eyes as he adjusted his stance, fingers flexing, ready to react if things took a sudden turn. Maya's heart pounded as she watched Captain Andrews inch closer to the young man, who was visibly struggling to keep his composure. She felt a surge of sympathy for him. She didn't know his story, but he didn't seem like a hardened criminal. He looked like someone caught in a situation he hadn't intended to create. "Listen," Captain Andrews said gently, his voice soothing. "I can tell you don't want to hurt anyone. But keeping that gun out is only making things worse for you. Just put it down, and I promise we'll listen to whatever you have to say." The young man swallowed hard, and his gaze shifted, flickering with doubt. Maya held her breath, hoping he'd lower the gun. She could feel the collective hope of the crowd, everyone silently willing him to make the right choice and bring this standoff to a peaceful end. But just as the young man seemed to waver, Bradley made his move. In one swift motion, he drew his weapon, aiming it directly at the young man. "Drop it," he shouted, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. The gunman's panic returned in full force, his eyes widening as he instinctively raised his gun higher, aiming it around the room. People screamed and ducked behind shelves, cowering from the possibility of gunfire. The once muted tension exploded, and Maya's heart sank, fearing that things were about to spiral out of control. Captain Andrews shot Bradley an infuriated glare. "Stand down, Bradley. You're escalating this situation." But Bradley ignored him, his voice rising with a cruel edge. "This kid doesn't deserve your sympathy, Captain. He's a threat, and we're putting people in danger by letting him wave that gun around." The young man's hands shook more violently, and his eyes were filled with fear and indecision. I didn't mean to scare anyone," he stammered, his voice breaking. I don't have anywhere else to go." Captain Andrews immediately seized the opportunity, his voice softer. "Then let us help you. We can get you the help you need. But you need to lower the gun." But Officer Bradley was clearly losing patience. "Captain, enough," he shouted, raising his weapon. "We don't negotiate with criminals." Maya's pulse quickened, and she felt a surge of fear. Bradley seemed intent on asserting his authority, even if it meant putting everyone in harm's way. She clenched her fists, her anger boiling as she watched him completely disregard the safety of everyone around him. The young gunman's gaze darted between Bradley and Andrews, his breaths quick and shallow. "Please, don't hurt me," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Captain Andrews held up his hands once more, his expression calm and compassionate. "I won't, son. No one here wants to hurt you. Just put down the gun, and we'll help you get out of this." But Bradley had finally lost all restraint. "I'm done playing this game," he spat, gripping his weapon tighter as he prepared to fire. Maya could feel the panic rising in her chest, the helplessness of watching a situation unfold that seemed doomed to end in violence. She knew she had to do something, anything, to prevent this from spiraling out of control. Her gaze moved quickly over the crowd, searching for some kind of distraction, an idea, a way to diffuse this moment. In a sudden burst of courage, Maya called out, her voice ringing through the air. "Enough," she shouted, stepping forward, startling both the officers and the gunman. The crowd gasped, and Captain Andrews threw her a cautionary look, silently urging her to be careful. But Maya refused to stand down. She met the young man's gaze, her expression softening. "Look," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever brought you to this point, you're not alone. We all have struggles, but this isn't the answer. Let the officers help you, and let these people get home safely." The young man's grip loosened slightly, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he was going to lower the weapon. Maya felt a glimmer of hope, sensing that her words had reached him. But Bradley, furious that he'd been upstaged, stepped forward, his gun raised higher, his voice a venomous hiss. "Don't listen to her," Bradley snarled, his face contorted with anger. "Drop the gun right now, or I will end this." The young man's eyes darted back and forth, his breathing uneven. He looked at Maya, then at Captain Andrews, and finally at Bradley. His hands shook as he hesitated, every muscle in his body tense as he weighed his options. But Captain Andrews wouldn't let Bradley's intimidation go unchecked. "Bradley," he barked, his voice firm and commanding, "stand down. This isn't a time for threats." The two officers glared at each other, locked in a silent power struggle that only seemed to make the young man more anxious. Maya held her breath, silently praying that Captain Andrews would prevail, that this situation would finally end without bloodshed. But just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, the young man's hand slipped, and his gun clattered to the floor, the sound echoing through the hushed store. He collapsed to his knees, his shoulders shaking as he let out a choked sob. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice filled with defeat. "I just didn't know what else to do." Captain Andrews immediately moved forward, kneeling beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay," he said gently. "You did the right thing by putting down the gun." But Bradley looked furious, his face red with suppressed anger. He shot Maya a glare, his expression livid. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for her to hear. As Maya met his gaze, she realized that this was only the beginning. The officer's disdain was clear, and she sensed that he wasn't about to let things go. She steeled herself, knowing that whatever lay ahead, she'd be ready to face it head-on. Welcome to a story hub dedicated to exposing, understanding, and discussing stories. Here, we dive deep into real-life experiences. By sharing these stories, we hope to create awareness, inspire change, and encourage open dialogue. If you're passionate about building a fairer world, please join us, like, comment, and subscribe to support the community and keep up with new stories each day. As the young man was carefully escorted by Captain Andrews, the air in the store seemed to settle, but only momentarily. Officer Bradley remained tense, his body language rigid with frustration. His eyes flickered between Maya, who was still standing a few feet away, and the direction in which the gunman had been led. It was clear he didn't like losing control of the situation. For him, it was all about dominance, and losing it in front of others, especially in front of someone like Maya, was something he couldn't easily swallow. Maya tried to steady her breath, the shock of the past few minutes still rattling her. She glanced over at the young man, now sitting on the floor with his hands cuffed behind his back, his eyes glazed with a mix of relief and fear. Captain Andrews stood beside him, his demeanor calm as he spoke to him in hushed tones, trying to keep the situation from escalating further. The bystanders, many of whom had been cowering behind displays moments before, began to relax as they processed what had just happened. But Maya wasn't so quick to let her guard down. Officer Bradley's glare lingered on her like a storm cloud, and she knew this wasn't over. She had a sinking feeling that whatever Captain Andrews said to the young man, Officer Bradley wouldn't let this slide so easily. A part of her was terrified, the adrenaline still pulsing through her veins, but the other part of her, stronger than ever, wanted to stay put, to see this through to the end. She wasn't going to let herself be intimidated. "Are you all right?" a voice asked, and Maya turned to find the young store associate who had tried to help earlier. The girl's face was pale, and she wore an expression that mirrored Maya's own feelings of unease. "I'm fine," Maya replied, though the words felt hollow. "Just shaken up." The associate nodded, glancing nervously back toward Officer Bradley. "You did well to stand up to him. I don't think anyone else would have been brave enough to speak up." Maya forced a smile. "I wasn't thinking about bravery. I just didn't want things to get any worse." Before the conversation could go any further, a voice interrupted them from behind. "Maya Thompson?" Maya turned to see Captain Andrews walking toward her, his expression professional but not without a hint of concern. The young man was now under control, 2 more officers joining Captain Andrews to escort him to the back of the store. Maya had no doubt that this was only a temporary resolution. "Yes," she answered cautiously, a knot forming in her stomach. "Are you sure you're all right?" Captain Andrews asked, his voice still carrying the calm authority it had before. "You've been through a lot tonight." Maya nodded but didn't immediately speak. She was still processing everything, still struggling to make sense of the past few minutes. She looked past him to where Officer Bradley stood, now speaking with one of the other officers in low tones. His face was dark with anger, and the body language he was projecting wasn't lost on Maya. "I'm fine," she said again, this time more firmly. "But I'd like to know what happens next." Captain Andrews regarded her with a solemn look. "Well, we'll have to take the young man down to the precinct for questioning. We'll get to the bottom of why he did what he did. But what you need to know right now is that the situation has been contained. There won't be any more threats here." Maya nodded, but she could see the unresolved tension in the air. Officer Bradley was still seething, his jaw tight and his posture stiff. She had no doubt that there was a part of him that saw her as an obstacle, something to be removed. She wondered how far he was willing to push things to keep control, and that thought made her uneasy. "Thank you for handling that," Maya said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Captain Andrews gave her a brief, respectful nod. "It's my job, Miss Thompson. But I do want to make sure you're safe. Do you need to file a report or anything?" Maya hesitated for a moment. Filing a report felt like a waste of time. She had done nothing wrong. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she needed some kind of closure from this encounter, something that would validate her experience. "I'll think about it," she said, her eyes lingering for a moment on Officer Bradley. He hadn't made any move to approach her, but the resentment in his gaze was unmistakable. As Captain Andrews turned to speak with the other officers, Maya made her way toward the exit, her mind racing. She needed fresh air. She needed to get away from the store, away from the looming presence of Officer Bradley. His unspoken threat still hung in the air, and she wasn't sure what to expect when she stepped outside. The store's automatic doors slid open with a whoosh as Maya walked toward the parking lot, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. She paused for a moment, looking up at the dark sky. The city had grown quiet after the chaos, but she could feel the tension building once more. Officer Bradley wasn't the type of man to let things go easily. She had no doubt that this encounter would have consequences, and she wasn't sure whether they would be directed at her or not. Maya's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the screen. It was a message from her sister, asking if she was okay. "I'm fine. Just dealing with a few things. I'll tell you about it later," Maya typed quickly before slipping the phone back into her pocket. A rustling sound behind her made her spin around. It was only a young woman, another shopper who had witnessed the earlier chaos. The woman's eyes were wide with curiosity, but she wasn't approaching Maya. She was simply standing a few feet away, watching her carefully. "You were brave back there," the woman said softly, her voice filled with admiration. "I don't think anyone else would have stood up to him like you did." Maya didn't know how to respond to that. It felt strange, like something she had done had been remarkable when, in her mind, it had been the only thing to do. "Thanks," Maya said after a beat, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "It wasn't easy." The woman nodded, her expression shifting to one of concern. "Do you think he'll come after you?" "The cop? Bradley?" Maya felt a shiver run down her spine at the mention of Officer Bradley's name. Her mind flashed to the dangerous edge in his voice when he had spoken to her, the barely concealed animosity that had pulsed between them. "I don't know," Maya admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think he'll forget what happened tonight." As if on cue, Maya heard the sound of a car engine roaring to life in the distance. The streetlights flickered, and she could sense that something was about to shift in the air. The night, which had already taken a dark turn, felt far from over. The tension that hung in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Maya stood in the parking lot, her eyes scanning the dimly lit street, feeling like a prey animal aware of its predator. Officer Bradley's glare from earlier still burned in her mind, and it had her feeling restless. He hadn't seemed like the type of man to let things slide, especially not after being outshined by Captain Andrews. The thought of what he might do next sent a ripple of unease through her chest. She glanced back at the store's entrance, half expecting Bradley to appear in the doorway, his expression filled with vengeance. But instead, the door remained shut, the store eerily quiet. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Maya pulled her jacket tighter around her body, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that something was coming. A car engine roared in the distance, but this time it wasn't the sound of someone driving away. No, it was the low growl of an engine revving up, getting closer, too close. She turned quickly, her instincts screaming at her to move. But before she could react, headlights blazed into her vision, blinding her temporarily. The car screeched to a stop just inches away from her, the tires grinding against the asphalt. Maya's heart jumped into her throat, her breath catching in her chest. The door of the car swung open, and out stepped Officer Bradley. "Did you really think you could just walk away, Maya?" His voice was colder now, filled with an unsettling calm that sent a chill down her spine. He was standing outside of his cruiser, staring at her with that same burning resentment. His posture was rigid, the kind of posture that only someone with a vendetta would adopt. Maya's heart raced, but she refused to show fear. She squared her shoulders, taking a deep breath, preparing for whatever was coming next. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Bradley," she replied, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Bradley's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" He sneered, his gaze now flickering toward the store behind her. "You think because you stood up to me in front of everyone that there won't be consequences. But you're wrong." Maya's pulse quickened, but she didn't back down. She met his gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. She'd seen men like him before, the ones who thought they could use power to crush others. But this time, she wouldn't let it happen. She wasn't backing down. "Bradley," she said, her tone even but firm, "you don't scare me." Bradley's lips curled into a twisted smile. He seemed to take pleasure in her defiance, his hands sliding into his jacket pockets. "Oh, I don't need to scare you, Maya. But I think you'll soon understand that not every fight is one you can win." Before she could process his words, the sound of a siren pierced the quiet night. The red and blue lights flashed in the distance, signaling the arrival of backup. Bradley's face darkened. He hadn't anticipated that. Maya could barely conceal her relief as two more police cruisers came into view, slowing to a stop behind Bradley's vehicle. The officers inside, both male, stepped out quickly, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. Bradley's posture stiffened as they approached, clearly not happy with the sudden intrusion. "Everything all right, Bradley?" one of the officers asked, his tone casual but alert. Bradley's expression was tight, his jaw clenched. "Everything's fine. Just a little chat with Ms. Thompson here." The other officer looked between them, eyebrows raised in silent confusion, but he didn't push the issue. He was, after all, just doing his job. "I suggest you leave her alone, Bradley," Maya said, her voice loud enough for the other officers to hear. "You have no reason to be threatening me. I did what any responsible person would have done." Bradley's eyes flashed with anger. "Responsible," he repeated with a mocking laugh. "You think standing up to me in front of everyone makes you some kind of hero? You're nothing but trouble." Maya's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and she took a step forward, determined not to let this slide. "If you think you can intimidate me, you're wrong," she said, her voice unwavering. "I won't let you get away with your threats, and I won't let you intimidate the people around me either." Bradley's gaze darkened, his hands tightening into fists. For a split second, Maya thought he might lash out, but instead, he stepped back, his face twitching with anger. "You'll regret this," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're so special, don't you? But I'll make sure you understand who has the power here." Maya stood her ground, her heart pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. As Bradley turned and stormed toward his car, Maya's eyes stayed locked on him. She didn't trust him for a second, and she knew that this wasn't over. This encounter was just one chapter in a much larger story, and Maya had a sinking feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. Once he was inside his cruiser, the engine roared to life, and with a screech of tires, Officer Bradley sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Maya stood still for a moment, breathing in the cool night air, trying to calm the storm that was brewing inside her. But she knew that her confrontation with Bradley wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. As the other officers made their way back to their cars, one of them, a woman with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense attitude, approached Maya. "You all right?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Maya nodded, still feeling the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "I'll be fine. Just shaken." The officer's gaze softened with empathy. "You did the right thing. You don't have to deal with people like him. Don't let him get under your skin." Maya looked up at her, meeting her gaze. "I won't. But I have a feeling this isn't over." The officer studied her for a moment, her eyes sharp, before giving a small nod. "If you need anything, if you need to file a report or anything like that, don't hesitate to reach out. We've got your back." Maya offered a grateful smile, though her mind was already racing with the possibilities. She wasn't sure what Officer Bradley had planned, but she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. Not now, not ever. As the officers drove away, Maya finally allowed herself to take a deep breath. But the unease in her stomach remained. She didn't trust Bradley, and she knew that if she didn't stand up to him now, things would only escalate. Her phone buzzed again, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it from her pocket and read the message from her sister. "Are you sure you're okay?" Maya typed back quickly, "I'm fine. Just a little shaken. But I'm dealing with it. I'll be home soon." She glanced back at the empty parking lot and the store behind her. Everything felt strangely quiet now, almost too quiet. The weight of the situation still pressed heavily on her shoulders, but she knew she couldn't back down. Officer Bradley had shown his hand, and now Maya was determined to make sure he didn't get away with his actions. The days that followed felt like a blur. Maya couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep within her. After the confrontation in the parking lot, she spent the next few days second-guessing herself, replaying every moment in her mind. Had she done enough? Was she really safe? Or had Officer Bradley merely been biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike? It wasn't just the adrenaline from the night of the incident that had left her on edge. It was the lingering sense of danger, the knowing that Bradley wouldn't let this go. He hadn't just been angry, he'd been humiliated. And Maya knew that men like him didn't tolerate humiliation easily. She didn't feel safe. Not anymore. Maya had made the decision to call in a few favors, to speak with some friends in higher places. Her instincts told her that Bradley wasn't done with her, and if things went sideways, she wanted to be prepared. The phone call she received a few days later only confirmed her worst fears. "Maya, it's Captain Andrews," the voice on the other end said, his tone calm, though she could hear the tension underlying his words. "You need to come to the station. There's something you need to see." Her stomach tightened at the sound of his voice. Something was wrong, she could feel it. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "I can't say much over the phone, but you need to come in." "It's about Officer Bradley," Captain Andrews replied before hanging up. Maya didn't hesitate. She grabbed her purse and headed straight for the station, a mix of dread and determination flooding her chest. She wasn't going to let Bradley intimidate her any longer. She was done being a pawn in his game. When she arrived at the precinct, the atmosphere inside was tense. Officers moved quickly and purposefully, casting furtive glances in her direction as if they all knew something she didn't. As she approached the front desk, the officer on duty, one she didn't recognize, gave her a tight smile and motioned for her to wait. A few moments later, Captain Andrews emerged from a hallway, his expression serious. "Maya," he said, his voice low. "I'm glad you came. We have something important to discuss." Without saying another word, he led her down the hallway and into a small, sterile room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, adding to the oppressive atmosphere. As they sat across from each other, Captain Andrews didn't waste time getting to the point. "I need you to listen carefully," he began, his gaze intense. "There's been a development in your case. Officer Bradley, he's under investigation." Maya's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "Why? We've been looking into his behavior, and it seems there's been a pattern: racist remarks, inappropriate conduct, threats, even some questionable use of force in the past. But what we didn't know was how far it had gone until now." Maya leaned forward, her mind racing. "What are you saying? What does this have to do with me?" "Bradley has been under surveillance for a while now," Captain Andrews continued. "We were investigating him for abuse of power, but we didn't have enough evidence to move forward, until you came into the picture. Your interaction with him, the way he handled the situation, was an eye-opener." Maya's stomach churned. She didn't want to be the person who had exposed Bradley's behavior, but at the same time, she knew this was bigger than her. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about everything he'd done to others, the way he'd abused his power. "I don't understand," Maya said, trying to piece everything together. "What's really going on?" "Bradley's been manipulating things behind the scenes," Captain Andrews explained. We've got a lot of intel that suggests he was planning something dangerous. He's been using his position to threaten people, to cover up his tracks. And now we know he's been trying to cover up his actions by targeting you." Maya's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, targeting me?" Captain Andrews leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Bradley has been orchestrating events behind the scenes. He's been trying to make you seem like the aggressor. He's been manipulating the story, telling people things that aren't true, making sure your name gets dragged through the mud. The things he said about you, we didn't realize the full extent until we dug deeper. But he's been trying to set you up." Maya's hands trembled. "Set me up for what? What has he been telling people?" "It's not just what he's been saying, it's what he's been doing. We have evidence that he's been planting false reports, trying to make you appear violent, unstable. He's been talking about you behind your back, making sure you don't get any support in the department. We've been following him closely, and it turns out he's been trying to push you out of the picture, Maya. And worse, he's been trying to turn this whole thing into something much worse." "Into what?" Maya whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "He's been planning to escalate things. He was waiting for an opportunity to frame you for something you didn't do," Captain Andrews said. "That's why he came after you so aggressively. He wanted to provoke a reaction, something he could use to take you down." Maya felt the weight of his words sink in. She wasn't just caught in a battle against one corrupt officer, she was being drawn into a web of lies, manipulations, and threats. And this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about keeping herself, and the truth, safe. Maya clenched her fists, a surge of determination flooding her. She wasn't going to let Bradley get away with it. She couldn't afford to. "You're not alone in this," Captain Andrews said, his voice firm. "We're moving forward with this investigation. We're going to expose everything he's done, and we're going to make sure he faces the consequences. But we need you to keep pushing, Maya. We need you to stay strong. He's dangerous, but so are we. And together, we'll bring him down." Maya nodded, a sense of resolve settling within her. The days that followed the meeting with Captain Andrews felt like a slow build towards something pushed aside. Maya had always been a woman of action, mistake of underestimating her more than ever. And now she was ready to take him down, a tightrope, balancing her own safety with the fight she knew was coming. She had become a target. Officer Bradley had made it clear that he wouldn't go down quietly, and Maya understood that now better than ever. Captain Andrews had set the wheels in motion. They were gathering the evidence, compiling the accusations, and making their case against Bradley. But Maya knew that in order for it to work, she had to play her part, without hesitation, without fear. She kept her head down, stayed low, and tried to keep her life as normal as possible. But it wasn't easy. Everywhere she went, she felt like eyes were on her, Bradley's eyes. The weight of his threat lingered like a dark cloud. Then, one night, it happened. Maya was leaving her apartment after a long shift, her body exhausted but her mind still racing. As she stepped out into the cool night air, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, recognizing the number immediately, Captain Andrews. "Talk to me," she said, trying to keep the unease from her voice. "We've got him," Captain Andrews replied, his voice filled with grim satisfaction. "It's over. We've gathered enough evidence to make the arrest. He's been involved in everything, the thefts, the planted evidence, the manipulation of reports. Bradley's done." Maya's heart skipped a beat, a mix of relief and dread washing over her. "What's the plan?" "We're making the move tonight," Captain Andrews said. "But we need you to stay put. We don't want him going on the defensive. We'll take care of him. You've done your part, Maya. You've helped us expose the truth. Now, just stay safe." Maya could hardly believe what she was hearing. After everything, the constant fear, the threats, it was finally over. But even as she tried to let the weight of the moment settle, a chilling thought struck her. If Bradley had been manipulating things for so long, what would he do now? If he knew he was cornered, would he make one last move? "I'll be careful," Maya said, though she wasn't sure she believed herself. "Good," Captain Andrews replied. "Stay inside. We'll keep you updated." With the call over, Maya stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. As the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something about this wasn't right. The world around her felt too quiet. The streets were eerily empty, and the hum of city life seemed muffled, distant. She couldn't help but wonder if Bradley had some final plan in mind. What if they weren't as prepared as they thought? Suddenly, the silence was broken. The unmistakable screech of tires echoed down the street. Maya's heart leapt in her chest as she turned toward the sound. The headlights of a car appeared around the corner, speeding toward her building. She could feel the adrenaline pumping, the familiar rush of fight or flight taking hold. As the car screeched to a halt in front of her apartment, she saw the silhouette of a man behind the wheel, no doubt Bradley. Maya's instincts screamed at her to run, to get inside and lock the door. But before she could react, the car door swung open. Maya froze. Standing there, with a smirk plastered across his face, was Officer Bradley. "You really thought you could get rid of me, didn't you?" he spat, his voice dripping with venom. His eyes were wild, the desperation in them unmistakable. Maya's pulse quickened. He wasn't supposed to be here, not now, not with everything on the line. "Bradley," Maya said, her voice steady but her body tense, ready to move at a moment's notice. "You're done. This ends tonight." His smirk only grew wider. "You think I'm going to let them arrest me? You think I'm going down like that? No. You've made a grave mistake." Without warning, Bradley pulled a gun from his belt, aiming it directly at Maya. The cold barrel of the weapon gleamed in the streetlight, sending a shockwave of terror through her body. She raised her hands instinctively, her mind racing. This wasn't the end. She couldn't let him win. "Bradley, don't do this," Maya said, her voice steady despite the fear. "You've already lost. There's no way out for you now." Bradley laughed bitterly, his fingers tightening around the gun's grip. "You don't get it, do you? You've been a thorn in my side from the moment you opened your mouth. And now, I'm going to make sure you never speak again." Maya's heart raced, but she didn't move. She knew that any sudden action could provoke him. Every part of her wanted to run, to dive for cover, but she stayed put. She knew that the longer she kept him talking, the more likely it was that someone would come to her aid. "You're not the hero here, Maya," Bradley sneered. "You're just a problem. You think you've won? Well, I've got news for you. This is far from over." The tension in the air was suffocating, the seconds ticking by in what felt like an eternity. Bradley's finger twitched, and Maya knew he was close to pulling the trigger. Suddenly, headlights from another car flooded the street, casting a harsh glow over the scene. The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, and Bradley's eyes flickered, just for a moment. That was all Maya needed. Without thinking, she lunged to the side, ducking behind a parked car for cover. The sound of gunfire rang out, but she was already out of his line of sight. Maya's heart pounded as she scrambled for her phone, dialing Captain Andrews' number in a panic. "Get here now," she gasped, barely able to form the words. "Bradley's got a gun. He's not going down without a fight." The sound of footsteps approaching made her freeze. Bradley had started moving, trying to flank her, but he didn't see the officers closing in from behind. Just as Bradley turned, ready to take another shot, Captain Andrews and his team swarmed in. In an instant, the officers had Bradley on the ground, his gun wrenched from his hand and secured in a matter of seconds. Maya watched in shock as the man who had terrorized her was cuffed and dragged away, his defiance turning to desperation. "Good job, Maya," Captain Andrews said, his voice filled with relief as he approached her. "You did great." Maya could only stare, her body still trembling from the close call. She had faced him down, but now that it was over, she felt the weight of everything that had happened. It was finished. Bradley was arrested, his web of lies unraveled in the light of the truth. As the sirens faded into the distance, Maya realized something important. She had won. The darkness he had tried to bring into her life was finally gone. But even more than that, she had fought for herself, and for the truth. And in the end, that was all that mattered.